Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of content, slow, immersive stories that help you fall asleep, take a moment now to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and if you find it's not for you, you can always unsubscribe later. No pressure at all. Now, let's leave the day behind. Take a deep breath, let the noise of the world fall away like dust from an old velvet curtain. You're here now with the past. If you're listening in the dark, even better. Let the low hum of your fan become the wind off ancient rooftops. Let the warmth of your blanket become the fire of a candlelit chamber. Tonight, we're not reading history. We're stepping into it, quietly, carefully. You're not just hearing a story, you're inside it. So before we begin, take a moment to let your body go heavy. Feel the bed beneath you. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. Let your fingers curl loosely. Let your feet fall outward. There's nowhere to be but here. No one to impress. Nothing to do. Just this moment, this breath, this story. Close your eyes if they're not closed already. It's not 20 or 25 anymore. Not here. Let's begin. The bell rings before the sun is up. You don't open your eyes at first. You don't need to. You know the sound by its weight in the air, the way it hums through the stone walls and lands gently in your bones. The bell is old. It has outlived every sister who's heard it. And still it calls you, same as it called them. You rise without complaint because the day has already begun, and the convent does not wait. The cold floor meets your feet with no ceremony. You slip into your habit, rough wool and linen drawn tight against the damp, and move through the corridor in silence, past shuttered windows, past the hush of sleeping herbs in the cloister garden. The others do not speak. You are not supposed to, not until after prayer, but you feel them, ghost-like shapes in the dawnlight, steps in rhythm with your own. You're one of the brewing sisters, and this is the part of the morning that belongs to you. There are no visitors yet, no town children crying from the gate for broth, no messages from the bishop's men, just the work. You slip into the brew house and breathe in. The scent is warm already. Barley and oak, steam and yeast. The memory of yesterday's batch still curling in the air like a forgotten hymn. There's peace here, deeper than in the chapel, deeper than in the reading room. You lift the wooden lid from the mash tun and lean over, letting the heat rise to your face. Everything is where you left it. Copper kettles polished to dull shine, stacks of dried herbs tied with linen thread, jugs of dark molasses and cloth-sacked hops. You whisper a psalm under your breath, just one line, not out of obligation, but because you can't remember ever starting a brew without it. The fire must be stoked. You kneel, feed it kindling, then larger pieces, your fingers blackened, your sleeves already kissed by smoke. The other sisters will come soon, one by one, to help stir or lift or clean. But the first moments are yours. Brewing is not just a task, it is memory. It is obedience. It is the craft of comfort. The people in the nearby village know your ale. They say the monks downriver sell barrels twice the size, stamped with holy crests and delivered by ox cart. But they don't taste like yours. Yours is for healing. Yours is for the sick, for mothers in confinement, for tired pilgrims and aging priests with shaking hands. Yours is warm and quiet and real. You measure the grain by touch. You've done this so many mornings that you no longer need the scales. You pour it into the steaming water, feel the first stir of the mash thicken under your hand. The wooden paddle is long and familiar, heavy with work, worn smooth by years of turning. Outside, the sky pales to milk. The sparrows begin their low chatter. Somewhere the stable boy is fetching water for the animals, but inside all you hear is the soft swirl of barley and heat. You remember what one of the older sisters once told you. Beer is not a luxury. It is bread in liquid form. It is strength for the weak and safety for those too poor to boil every bucket they drink. Water can kill, beer keeps them alive. The other sisters arrive one by one as the brew thickens. One has her hands still wrapped in cloth from the burn she got on Candlemas. Another hums as she works, though she never remembers the same tune twice. They greet you with nods, not words. The vow of silence still holds. But you speak through your motion, passing the ladle, adjusting the stones under the pot, guiding the younger girl's hands when she sprinkles the hops. You feel the day unfolding, not in hours, but in scent. First the sweetness of wet grain, then the rising sharpness of boil, then later the soft, bitter perfume of hops, like dried flowers wrapped in a kiss of vinegar. They say the monks downriver have a new system. Pipes and pulleys, a hired master from the city. They say the monastery's beer brings in enough coin to fund repairs and buy new vestments. But you've heard too from travellers who pass through that the taste is flat, that something is lost, that the barrels grow sour by the time they reach the border towns. You wonder, sometimes, if it is because they brew for glory. You do not. You brew because you were taught by the sister before you, and she by the one before her, and because the convent needs it to care for those who knock at the gate with fevered eyes or hollow cheeks. You add herbs, crushed fine between your palms, sage, rosemary, a pinch of lavender for calm. You don't always use the same ones. You listen to what the day tells you. Cold weather means more yarrow. Warm weather calls for astringents. It is not guessing, it is listening. And the brew listens too. It bubbles soft at first, then with more certainty, as if it too remembers the path. You skim the foam, catch the impurities, let the steam rise. The prioress passes by the doorway and nods once, approving. She doesn't ask about the monks. She knows. She tasted their ale once at a synod. She said it was prideful. The sun climbs, the silence lifts. The bell rings for terce, and your hands are still warm from the copper when you enter the chapel. The chant is soft today, and your voice doesn't tremble. You think about the yeast resting in its crock, waiting to be added at just the right moment. You think about the people who will come, hungry or ill or grieving. They will drink your beer and not know it was made with lavender or prayer. They will not know your name, but they will feel it. And you will rise tomorrow and brew again, the same way, with the same hands, because that is what sisters do. They serve, and sometimes they brew better than the monks. The prayers at terce settle into your chest like warm cloth, and when the final syllable fades into the rafters, you rise again. Not quickly, but steadily, the way all movement is meant to be in this place. You return to the brewhouse by habit, not urgency. The yeast is ready. The mash has cooled just enough. One sister has been watching it carefully while you prayed, her fingers resting on the side of the vessel, like someone checking a child's forehead for fever. You nod to her. She lifts the lid. The scent is deeper now, richer, heavier, touched with the sweetness of grain that's given up everything it had. You stir once more, then add the yeast, slow and steady, whispering nothing this time. There's no need, and knows what to do. You cover it, mark the time on the wall with a piece of chalk, then wipe your hands on your apron and lean against the doorframe. The fire crackles low. You feel the sweat at the back of your neck. Not discomfort, just proof that the work is done for now. You think of the people who will drink this batch. There's a traveller who arrives each season, limping from an old wound, always with a small sack of apples or dried beans for trade. He never speaks more than a few words, but he always bows when he takes the ale. Then there's the carpenter's wife, who lost 2 children to fever, and now cares for her third with the worry of someone who's already grieved too much. The sisters send her a jug each month. No charge, just quiet mercy. Hospitality is not a choice. It is written into your bones. When the gate bell rings and someone asks for shelter, you do not weigh the cost. You open the door. You set out broth and ale and bread. Sometimes all you have is the ale. It fills what the bread cannot. It warms what the fire won't reach. They say that monks make strong beer, better for shipping, better for storing in barrels sent to lords and bishops. But your ale is not meant to last. It is meant to comfort, and comfort does not wait. You remember the story of a pregnant woman who arrived on foot 2 winters ago, her feet cracked and bleeding, her breath a trembling thing. She had been turned away by 3 houses before she reached you. The sisters took her in. You brewed with mint and rosemary that week, bitter herbs to steady the stomach and soothe the nerves. She named the child after one of the sisters, though no one asked her to. That was never the point. The convent's survival depends in part on the ale, not in coin, but in trust. The people bring what they can: eggs, cloth, baskets of wheat, sometimes nothing but a quiet thank you, and in return they are cared for. It is not business. It is balance. It is the way the world should be. You have seen the ledgers, the scratched ink kept by the prioress. No profit, no tithe, just enough. And always, beside the notes for grain and hops and firewood, a column marked mercy. No numbers, just names. There is structure here, order, a rhythm older than the hands that keep it. The rule guides you, not just in prayer, but in motion, in thought, in how the kettles are cleaned and the barrels stacked. Obedience is not mindless. It is a shared language. When you brew, you follow the same pattern used by those before you. You stir with the same hand they did. You wait the same number of breaths before lifting the lid. It is not superstition. It is care, a sacred kind. The monks are said to be efficient. Their breweries are larger. They use pulleys now, some even water wheels. A man from the nearby village once told you that a single monk can brew what it takes 4 of you to finish. But he also said the ale tastes like metal, that it turns sour after 3 days, that it fills the stomach but not the soul. You do not speak ill of them. That is not your way. But you know, because travellers come here even after visiting them. You know because they finish their cup and ask if there's more. You do not write recipes. You remember them. You adjust them. A colder spring means slower fermentation. A rainy week means watching for mould. You learn to read the signs, the hiss of a batch that's too hot, the silence of yeast that needs more rest. The herbs speak too. You run your fingers over them each morning in the garden, listening to what they offer. Some are best for bitterness, others for calm. Some are sharp, meant to clean the mouth and clear the thoughts. Brewing is not science to you. It is a kind of listening. And there are days you wonder why it was forgotten. Why, in all the books, they speak of monks and their mighty brewing halls and the coins they earned for their abbeys, but say nothing of the women who brewed with care and gave it away. Perhaps it is because your barrels bore no seal. Perhaps because you sang no songs of your ale, carved no names into the wood. You only poured, only stirred, only served, but the people remembered they did. You know this because when you walk to the well in the afternoon, the butcher's boy nods to you with something like reverence, because the women who wash their clothes at the stream sometimes ask what you've brewed this week. Because when you are old and your hands too stiff to stir, the younger sisters will carry your herbs in linen and say your name, even if softly, even if just once. Evening comes slowly, thick with the scent of cooling mash and wood smoke. You finish the last of the clean-up, check the seals on the barrels, wash your hands in lavender water, and hang your apron by the door. You pass by the chapel on your way to the refectory and pause, not out of obligation, but out of habit. The candlelight flickers low. A breeze stirs the hem of your habit. You do not pray aloud. You only stand there a moment, remembering how the air smells on brewing days, and how quiet it feels when the work is finished, and the ale rests, and the world waits. The monks will be remembered, their names carved in stone, their ales sold in bottles now, far from the riverside abbeys where they were first poured. But you brewed better, not louder, not stronger, just better. Because you brewed with care, because you brewed with mercy, and because you knew, without needing to be told, that beer was never just drink. It was devotion, served warm. The brewing room changes with the seasons, though its walls stay the same. In winter the air clings to your skin, and the breath from your lips hangs like fog above the kettles. In summer the stone sweats beneath your feet, and the barrels ferment faster than you'd like. You learn to read these changes, not with instruments, but with your hands, your nose, your ears. You press your fingers against the tun to feel the temperature. You tilt your head to hear the shift in the bubbling foam. You lift the lid and listen, not just for sound, but for what the brew is trying to say. Because it speaks, not in words, but in rhythm. You start always with the grain. Barley is what you use most. It stores well, holds its strength through long seasons, and breaks down in water the way bread does in the mouth. Sometimes oats are added, especially if the grain from the last harvest was thin. You run your fingers through the sacks before you use them. You crush a handful. You smell the dust. If it smells like earth, it's good. If it smells like mould, you set it aside. Even a handful can ruin the batch. The water comes from the well behind the garden. It is drawn before sunrise when the air is still clean and the bucket hasn't picked up heat from the sun. Some say the taste of the beer comes from the water. You believe it. The water here is soft. It moves slow, like a prayer whispered through cupped hands. You filter it through cloth before pouring it into the copper kettle, watching for flecks, for shadows, for anything that shouldn't be there. Water is dangerous if you forget it needs care, but treated with respect it becomes the life of the brew. You stir the mash in silence. The paddle is long, carved by a sister who died 20 winters ago. Her name burned faintly into the handle. No one speaks of her often, but everyone uses her paddle. That's how memory survives here. Not in stories, in tools, in the way you hold them, in the way you never quite set them down without care. The mash grows thick, turns dark, and the scent rises like bread in an oven, warm, filling, close. You taste it once, quickly from the edge of the spoon. Sweet. Not ready, but almost. Then come the herbs. You keep them in the apothecary room, dried and labelled, though the labels are mostly for the younger sisters. You can tell them apart by scent. Sage is crisp. Yarrow is bitter. Rosemary makes your throat sting in a way that feels like medicine. You do not add them all, only what's needed. Some days you add none. Others, you crush 3 different herbs in your hands and let the dust fall straight into the boil. Each choice means something. Sage for fever, mint for nausea, lavender for sleeplessness. You are not brewing ale, you are brewing relief. There was a time, you've been told, when hops were not used. Back then, beer spoiled quickly, went sour in days. Then came the writings of a woman, long ago, far from here, who praised the hop's bitter flower and taught others how to dry it, steep it, preserve the brew. Her name does not often appear in the books written by men, but you've heard of her. You've read her words, copied in the margins of a sister's journal. Hops prevent putridity. They ease melancholy. You like that. You believe both. You add the hops carefully, not all at once. You time them like verses in a hymn. 1 handful early, for bitterness. 1 midway, for balance. And 1 near the end, for scent. They open in the heat like petals. They change everything. The air sharpens, the taste deepens. The beer that was once gentle becomes complex. You like that too. You learned this not from books, but from standing beside women whose hands never stopped moving. You learned when to lift the lid, when to listen, when to wait. The ale does not always do what you expect. Sometimes it turns, sometimes it dies, sometimes it flourishes in ways you can't explain, but you never stop tending it. You clean the vessels with hot water and lye. You rinse until your knuckles go raw. You dry the barrels with cloths kept only for that task. Cleanliness is not a preference. It is survival. You do not waste. You do not rush. The yeast is last. It is kept warm, near the hearth, in a ceramic crock sealed with cloth and string. You feed it twice a day. Honey, flour, sometimes a bit of the last batch to remind it of its purpose. You call it by no name, but the older sisters once called it the sister of the brew, a living thing, and you believe that too. You lift the cloth, sniff gently, sour but sweet, alive. If it smells of death, you start again, but today it smells right. You mix it in with slow circular movements. The surface changes, the bubbles begin. The yeast eats and breathes. The brew is now alive, just as you are, just as everything in this place depends on what cannot be seen. You seal the vessel and carry it down into the cool cellar, where stone walls keep the temperature steady and barrels rest like sleeping animals. There are tools the monks use now that you do not have. Thermometers, pressure gauges, special pulleys that lift the grain so no one must carry it. You've heard that some monasteries even weigh every ingredient with perfect precision. But the villagers who pass through say their ale tastes the same, batch after batch. Yours does not. Yours changes. Slightly. Subtly. It remembers the weather, the mood, the air on the day it was made. Each batch tells the truth of its making. That's what matters to you. That each vessel holds more than ale. It holds care. It holds attention. It holds the hands of every woman who came before you and every woman who will follow. It is not beer that you serve at the gate when someone is ill. It is comfort, liquid and warm and real. They say monks brew for kings. You brew for mothers, for tired travellers, for the dying and the grieving. You brew because someone must. Tomorrow you will start again. Not because you are told to, but because the grain will need soaking, and the kettle will need tending, and the yeast will be waiting. And because someone will knock at the gate, asking for help, and what you offer will be enough. You have been told many times that your work is not the centre of the world, that your voice is not meant to carry, that what you do here is service, not history. And still, you stir the pot each morning. Still, you kneel by the fire and test the heat of the boil with the back of your hand. Still, you pour the wort through cloth and wait for the yeast to breathe. There is a kind of worship in waiting. Not the loud kind, not the kind that earns notice, but the kind that lasts. You have never brewed for recognition. You have never carved your initials into the wood. The monks do. Their casks bear stamps, bold symbols of ownership and pride. Some even write their names into records kept in the bishop's library, claiming innovation, perfecting ratios, measuring yield against glory. You have none of those things, but you have something else, the memory of a sister whose hands move just like yours, the same slow, patient motions, the same quiet breath before she lifted the lid. She taught you how long to boil, how to taste the wort with just the tip of your tongue, how to tell when a brew has turned, not by smell, but by silence. A good brew, she once said, knows it is loved. You think about that often, about the things love teaches and the way devotion shows itself in repetition. You do not ask for change. You do not long for tools or new methods. You long for only one thing, that the ale be true, that it be what it must be, that it serve. You do not need the world to remember you, but you want the brew to remember. There are rhythms to this work, patterns within patterns. You begin with prayer. You move to grain. You measure with your fingers, not because you doubt the scale, but because your hands have learned the language of weight. You trust them, just as you trust the silence, the chant, the bell that calls you away and the one that calls you back. The yeast waits. It never rushes. It becomes what it must in its time. So do you. The younger sisters sometimes ask why we do not record our recipes, why we do not preserve each batch in written form. You tell them that every brew is already recorded, in taste, in scent, in what it gives and what it asks. It is not forgetting, you say, to let something be alive. A fixed brew is a dead one. A recipe carved in stone is no better than spoiled grain, but one that adapts, one that feels the season, the mood of the garden, the weight of the air, that is sacred. There are stories of monks who invented new ways to speed the brewing, who found chemicals to make fermentation predictable, who raised whole buildings just for the boil. Their work is impressive. Their skill is not in question. But you wonder sometimes if they ever stop and listen, if they ever place a hand on the tun and wait for the ale to speak, if they ever think about the face of the traveller who will drink it, or if they only think about how many barrels it will fill. You have seen their ale. It is clear, precise, controlled, and it tastes like discipline, like metal pipes and polished vats and steam that doesn't smell of barley. Yours is not clear. It is not always perfect. Sometimes the herbs are stronger than expected. Sometimes the season pulls it toward bitterness. But it is never hollow, it never forgets itself, and neither do you. Once, many years ago, a monk visited the convent to share his method. He was polite. He carried a book bound in leather and spoke with words sharpened by study. He offered his measurements, his times, his weights. He explained how the right system could double your output. The prioress listened quietly. Then she handed him a cup of your brew. He drank, slowly, then again. He asked what was in it. She smiled. "Time," she said. He never returned. There is something holy in letting things take their time, in knowing that your hands are not the only ones at work. The yeast works too, the fire, the herbs, even the air that filters through the high windows and stirs the steam. They all play their part, and you're simply the one who listens. You remember one winter when the yeast failed. The whole batch died. You had done everything the same. Nothing had changed, and yet it turned bitter, sour, thick with wrongness. You buried it in the garden, not poured. Buried. Like a child not born right. That's what it felt like. You did not speak for 2 days, and then the prioress came and said only this: "It's not your fault. Even the faithful sometimes fall silent." You began again the next day. The next batch sang. There is no shame in failure, only in indifference, and you have never been indifferent. Each step matters. Each choice echoes. The herbs you choose today may ease the pain of someone tomorrow. The time you give the wort to cool may be the difference between comfort and illness. And though you will not see the face of everyone who drinks your ale, you will feel them. You will know, in some quiet way, that your hands reach theirs. You do not expect history to remember you. The names of women who brewed with care have already been erased from the records. The guilds rose and the convents fell. The men took the tools and closed the books. But the ale remembers, and perhaps that is enough. At Compline, your body is tired, not weak, just full of the day. Your hands smell faintly of hops and smoke. You sit in the stillness, candlelight flickering against the stone. Your eyes drift closed, not from boredom but from peace. The work is done, and the ale is resting. And somewhere, in a corner of the cellar, a barrel breathes. They never said it outright. Not in sermons, not in letters, not even in passing. But you knew. Everyone did. There was always a quiet question hanging in the air. Whose ale was better? Theirs or yours? The monks brewed for show, for coin, for reputation. Their barrels bore the marks of their order. Their seals pressed in wax. Their deliveries handled by servants in tidy carts. When their ale reached the village, it came with stories. How it won praise at a bishop's feast, how a traveller had taken it all the way to court, how it could last weeks without souring. But when your ale reached the same table, it came without a name, no seal, no label, just a jug handed from sister to hand, often wrapped in cloth, sometimes still warm. You never entered their halls, but you heard them described. Polished stone, tall kettles, marble floors washed clean with buckets of boiled water. The monks brewed standing tall, with charts nailed to the walls and ledgers open beside them. They measured with iron weights, wrote with feathered quills, recorded everything. They did not stir with their hands. They stirred with paddles fixed to rods turned by levers. Their brewing was precise and prideful. It was beautiful in its own way. But it was not alive. People came to you when they were sick, not just ill with fever or pain, but weary, grieving, quiet in the way that sorrow makes you quiet. They did not ask for monk ale. They asked for yours. They asked with downturned eyes and wrung hands and voices soft with need. They never used the word better, but they said things like yours sits gentler on the stomach, or it doesn't make my head heavy, or it tastes like home. Once, a farmer brought both, one jug from the monks, one from your convent, to his wife, who had not eaten in 3 days. She drank yours. Only yours. He came back a week later and left bread by the gate, though no one had asked. Another time, a child who could not keep food down took only sips of the ale you made with fennel and mint. The mother cried when the colour returned to her daughter's face. No one wrote about it. But you remembered. The villagers knew. They always knew. Some still bought the monks' barrels because they lasted longer, because they were easier to carry, because they came with coins and contracts. But for the people who needed real care, who needed softness, they came to you. They came with aching limbs, with mourning, with small offerings, and they left lighter. Not healed, but held. The monks visited once, many years ago, a delegation. They said it was to discuss trade, to form friendship between houses, to offer assistance. But they asked many questions, too many. They asked about your grain, your water source, your herbs. One even leaned over a barrel to sniff, and made a face like he had tasted salt. You did not answer. You did not need to. Your prioress poured them a cup each, and you watched them drink. Their faces were polite, blank. But one, just one, closed his eyes, just for a second. And when he opened them, he said nothing, just nodded. They did not return. It wasn't a rivalry the way men would speak of rivalry. There were no contests, no feasts with judging panels, no public praise or criticism, but it was there. You felt it in the way people whispered, in the way travellers asked if they could take a jug home, and whether the monks would notice. You heard it in the stories told over bread, about how the monk's ale once turned to vinegar before it reached the city, or how a sick girl who drank yours slept through the night for the first time in weeks. But you never bragged. You were taught not to, and you never let it into your brewing hand. You stirred with the same care whether the ale was for a bishop or a beggar. You never thought about best, only about true, only about whether it would help, whether it would comfort, whether it would be enough. There was one sister, long before your time, whose recipe book still lives on the shelf above the grain sacks. The pages are stained and warped, the ink faded but the notes remain. She did not write measurements, only feelings. For sorrow, use rosemary. For long winters, more mint. For children, sweeten slightly. She never once mentioned the monks. She brewed as if they did not exist. You think of her often. Her silence was not ignorance, it was clarity. There is a kind of strength in being forgotten, not erased, but uncounted, unnamed. You look at the way the villagers speak of monk ale, formal, distant, admired, but never loved. And then you look at the way they drink yours, slowly, gratefully, with their eyes lowered and their shoulders loose for the first time in days. They say monks make ale for occasions. You make ale for survival. And yet, you know how stories work. You know what gets remembered. The monks' names will be carved into stone. Their methods passed down through guilds, printed in books, studied in halls. Your ale will vanish, absorbed into the quiet of the earth. Your hands will not be written into any history. Your barrels will rot. Your herbs will grow wild again. And still, you would not trade places. You do not brew for history. You brew for now, for the knock at the gate, for the stranger's sigh, for the small unseen miracle of rest. Once, during the Feast of St. John, a traveller asked if you had ever tasted the monk's ale. You hadn't. You said so. He looked surprised. "Don't you want to compare?" he asked. You smiled and said only, "No." Not because you feared it. Not because you thought yours was better. But because brewing is not about competition. It's about listening. And the ale has already spoken. You think about that now as you lean over the latest batch. It is nearly ready. This scent tells you so. The herbs have softened, the yeast has risen, and the foam has thinned to lace. You skim the surface, feel the warmth through the cloth, and close your eyes. It has nothing to prove, and neither do you. There were days when the bell stopped ringing. Not because the rope had frayed or the wind had died, but because the order had changed. You woke early still, your body unwilling to forget, but the silence that met you was different. Not sacred, not calm, just empty. The fire in the brew house remained unlit. The garden went untended, and the casks sat unused, their wooden sides swelling with the damp and beginning to split. You were told the king's men had closed the larger abbey down the valley. that the nuns there had been sent away, their belongings inventoried, their ale barrels emptied into the river to keep villagers from stealing the last sips. You heard that the monks nearby had been spared, that they had signed something, handed over something, promised something. You did not know what. Only that their brewing continued, yours did not. The Reformation came like a cough in a quiet room, small at first, then impossible to ignore. What had once been devotion was now called superstition. What had once been service was now labelled waste. Convents closed one by one, their sisters scattered to family homes, poor houses, or the mercy of neighbours who remembered their kindness but not their names. And with each closed door another brew was lost. Not the recipe, not exactly, but the way the yeast tasted when stirred with certain words, the feel of the mash in winter light, the scent of yarrow on a rainy morning. The guilds rose in their place, men with aprons and scales and silver tokens engraved with seals. Brewing became industry, a man's trade. It had rules now and laws and certifications. You could not sell without permission. You could not call it ale unless it passed inspection. And women? They were not permitted to brew in many towns, not for sale, not for trade, not even to give away unless it was within the house and out of sight. If caught, they could be fined. If stubborn, worse. You saw it happen. You heard the whispers. A widow in the next parish punished for selling beer from her back door. A healer fined for making her herb ale too bitter, accused of mixing it like a witch. And the sisters? No one came for them, because there were no sisters left. The doors were barred. The brew house was cold, and you were no longer allowed to gather the herbs in the same open way. What was once ritual became memory. What was once daily rhythm became something you explained only if someone asked, and fewer did each year. The name of the prioress who first added rosemary for grief? Forgotten. The sister who carved the paddle still kept in the cellar? Unknown. The one who wrote her recipes in the margins of a psalter, in soft, slanted Latin. Lost. You still brewed. Quietly, in small pots behind shuttered windows. Not for coin, not for praise, only for those who needed it, only for those who remembered to knock. And still the monks' brewing thrived. It became a brand, a reputation. Their names, once humble, now printed on labels, shipped in boxes, poured into goblets by hands that would never stir a mash themselves. They brewed with machines, with precision, with funding, but not with memory, not with prayer, not with silence. You kept the old ways, not from stubbornness, but from truth. The herbs still grew, though fewer each spring. The yeast still lived, though more careful now. And you still woke early, even when the bell no longer rang, even when the cloister paths were overgrown, even when no one came to ask for ale by name. There is a grief that lingers in silence, not the loud kind, the kind that settles in your hands and stays there, humming. You feel it when you clean the kettle with no one watching, when you carry the mash water through the garden, stepping around stones no longer lined, when you open the cellar and smell the slow breath of a fermenting brew and know that no one will taste it but you. But there is also peace in it, because you remember, and remembering is a kind of resistance. You pass the knowledge quietly now, to girls who ask, to widows who knock, to women who bring their own sacks of grain and say softly, "I heard you still make it the old way." You do not teach in books, you teach with your hands. You stir once slowly and watch if they understand. If they don't, you stir again. You show them which herbs to choose, not with instructions, but with fingers brushed across leaves. You tell them to wait, to listen, to trust the yeast, to trust the time, because it still matters, even now, even when the world forgets, especially then. You know that history won't write this part. It will say brewing was perfected in halls and monasteries, that monks carried it forward, that they refined the craft and shaped the standard. It will not say that nuns brewed for centuries in stone kitchens with wooden paddles and herbs grown by hand. It will not say that people trusted your ale more than they trusted sermons. It will not say that your beer was once all that stood between life and sickness for whole villages. But you will say it, here, in silence, in practice, in the way you brew, in the way you remember, and maybe, just maybe, that is enough. Because even if the walls fall, the chant stops, the herb garden goes wild, and the books go blank, the yeast still rises, the water still warms, the scent still clings to the air like memory, and your hands. Your hands still know what to do, the yeast still lives. You check it each morning the way you once checked the sky for weather, quietly, with care, not expecting miracles, but always listening for breath. The cloth that covers its vessel is stained with time, soft with handling, replaced more times than you can count. It rises when the room is warm, slumps when the fire goes out early, and sometimes, just sometimes, it bubbles up before you've even touched it. Like it remembers what it's for. You think about that often, about what remembers when people don't. About what endures not in books or bells, but in rhythm, in scent, in the quiet way that things hold on without asking to be noticed. You no longer keep a garden the way you used to, not formally, not by rows or rules, but the herbs still grow, scattered and stubborn. A bit of sage near the steps, a patch of lavender beneath the wall, rosemary at the far end of the path, gnarled and half wild. You didn't plant them again, not exactly. But the seeds fell, and the soil remembered, and now they bloom each spring like nothing ever changed. You clip them carefully. Not every stem, not every time, just enough. You dry them the old way, in cloth sacks by the window, turned daily, whispered to like they are children waking from sleep. When you crush them, the scent rises like a hymn, the kind you used to sing before someone told you not to. There are women now who come not to kneel but to ask. They wear no veil, no habit. They bring their own grain, their own questions. Some are young and curious, others older and already knowing, looking only for confirmation that they aren't alone in remembering. You show them the crock, the paddle, the stone sink stained with hundreds of brews. You say little, they say less, but their hands move with purpose. They know the weight of things, they feel it. You teach not by speech but by stillness. You let them stir. You nod when they ask if the wort should hiss like that. You correct gently when the herbs are too much. And when they get it right, when the scent rises and the surface blooms, you step back and say only, now you know. You have no apprentices, not officially. There is no order left to pass the title through, no abbess to name the next brewer. But still, the knowledge spreads, quietly, softly, through hands and taste and trial. They do not need the church to remember you. The yeast is enough. The scent is enough. The way someone sips and sighs and closes their eyes is enough. That is your record. That is your legacy. You've heard that in another country a woman is brewing again in the style they once called forgotten. She read something, found a page in an archive, a letter, a note scribbled in the back of a saint's book. You do not know her. You will never meet. But you think of her as kin. Because she brews with herbs. Because she uses cloth instead of metal strainers. Because someone said her ale tasted like home. And that is how you know. It is not lost, not fully, not yet. You do not believe in ghosts the way some people do, but you believe in memory that breathes, in steam that carries voices, in barrels that remember every hand that ever scrubbed their sides. When you step into the cellar, even now, even alone, you feel them. Not as visions, as presence. The women who brewed before you, their laughter, their silence, their hands pressed over yours the first time you spilled too much grain or let the fire go out too early. You carry them not as weight, but as warmth. You're never alone down here. The air is thick with what remains. Sometimes the brew is quiet, sometimes it doesn't rise, sometimes it spoils, even now. You do not cry when that happens. You used to, but now you simply start again. Not because it doesn't matter, but because you know that memory does not live in perfection. It lives in repetition, in trying, in returning to the work even after the world has forgotten its name. The world will say that monks shaped brewing, that science came from monasteries, that the art of ale belonged to men in robes and stone-walled halls. Let them. Let the books tell that story. You do not need your truth in ink. You have it in taste, in smell, in the way the heat feels against your palm, in the way your knees rest against the floor beside the kettle, in the way someone's voice softens when they say, "Thank you." You think sometimes about what will happen when your hands can no longer lift the pot, when your breath shortens before the steam rises, when the yeast waits too long and no one comes to stir it. But then you remember the girl last spring, the one who came barefoot with ash on her sleeves and hope in her eyes. She didn't speak at first, just watched, then copied, then got it wrong, then tried again. Her third batch sang. You didn't tell her that, but she knew, she tasted it. She stayed until the fire burned low, then left without a word. But she'll be back, or someone like her. They always come back, because the ale remembers, because the silence tells them where to go. In the final light of day, the cellar is golden. Dust floats like prayer in the sunbeams, and the barrels breathe slow and steady, as if asleep. You lean against the wall, hands folded, the scent of barley thick around you. You close your eyes, not to dream, but to listen. The ale is ready, and so are you. You were never named in the records, but you were always here, brewing quietly. They came at dawn, when frost still clung to the stone steps, and the sky was pale with a kind of light that promised cold, not warmth. You heard them before you saw them, boots that struck like hammers on packed earth, not the soft shuffling of pilgrims, but the deliberate march of men sent to take something away. They entered the scriptorium with calm voices and scrolls in hand, bearing the king's seal and the bishop's blessing, naming titles aloud, books you had copied, dusted, touched with reverence, and set them in baskets as if they were common grain. No one spoke, no one dared. The firewood was already stacked outside. You watched from the back, hidden behind the rows of shelves, your hands tucked into your sleeves, your heart like a fist of thorns. Among the titles they named was one you had hidden months before, a codex in a language no one in the abbey could read, its script not Latin, not Greek, something older and deeper, the letters shaped like waves and wind, found by accident or perhaps by fate, tucked behind a shelf where the candlelight never reached. You hadn't meant to keep it, but you hadn't meant to let it burn either. That night, after the flames took the rest, you returned alone, lifted the board you had loosened in secret, and placed the book beneath the floor wrapped in cedar oil and cloth, sealing it into the stone with hands that did not tremble. You prayed nothing, not time, not rats, not men with swords who would ever find it. They said you vanished years later, left your robe folded and sandals by the basin, disappeared without a word. But the floor still remembers, and the book is still there, asleep in the dark, waiting for someone who will listen. The years passed not as chapters or seasons, but as a deepening of silence, like sediment settling at the bottom of a well, and you learned to live among things that no longer moved. The bell still rang at dawn, the psalm still rose like breath from the chapel, the ink still flowed across the pages you copied by hand. But something in you had changed. Some inner thread pulled taut the day the fire took the library. Though you rose and knelt and obeyed as always, you did so with a quiet that was no longer submission, but something else. Witness, perhaps, or warning. You continued your duties without question, yet your mind always returned to the boards beneath the shelf, to the book wrapped in cedar and oil and cloth, untouched, yet alive in your memory, pulsing faintly beneath every prayer and every pen stroke, as if you had buried not only a text but a question the world no longer wanted to ask. No one spoke of the fire after that week. No one mentioned what was lost. The guards never returned, as though the work had been done and the silence that followed was proof enough of obedience. But you knew better. Books could be burned, but not memory, not meaning, not the ache left behind by what was once known. You began to notice small things, patterns you hadn't seen before, brothers who hesitated at certain pages, a novice who asked a question and was told not to, a visiting cleric who carried with him a sealed pouch and eyes that didn't linger too long on anything that might think back. You kept your head bowed, your ink steady, but your mind wandered often to the space beneath the floor, to the curled corners of that hidden script and the knowledge it held, not just in its words, but in its refusal to vanish. Sometimes, when the others slept, you would walk the cold halls, barefoot and unseen, past the cloister garden, past the unused wing where ivy crept across stone. You would sit beside the shelf, your back against the wall, your palms resting over the boards as if to feel the faint pulse of something sacred. And though you never lifted it, never opened it again, the presence of it grounded you, reminded you that not all vows were spoken aloud, not all devotion required approval. One autumn, a young brother named Kieran arrived, eager and clumsy and full of questions, the kind that made older monks frown and younger ones avoid him. You saw yourself in him, not the boy you had been, but the man you could have become had the world not taught you to swallow wonder before it could form into speech. He followed you often, not intrusively, just nearby, always watching, sometimes helping. You did not send him away. You let him linger as you copied pages, as you sorted herbs in the cold room, as you swept the alcove where the old texts were stored. He never asked directly. But one evening, as the light faded and the others gathered for supper, he remained behind and said, "There are spaces between the walls that don't match the blueprints." You did not respond, but you felt a ripple of alarm. Not fear, a shift, like something long still beginning to stir. He didn't press, you didn't explain. But from that night forward he seemed quieter, more measured, his questions fewer, his steps more deliberate. As if some answer had reached him without needing to be spoken. You wondered privately if the silence between you had said more than any confession could. The years continued. The world outside the walls changed. New kings, new laws, new fears. But the monastery held its rhythm, its stillness, its slow, deliberate forgetting. Until one winter when the snow came early and heavy, blocking the road for weeks, keeping even the most devout from visiting. The abbey folded in on itself like a held breath, and you found yourself once again kneeling alone in the scriptorium. The wind howled outside, the fire burned low, your hands rested on a scroll you could have copied in your sleep, your eyes fixed on the place where the light didn't reach. You knew then that your time was thinning, not with dread, but with clarity. You began to prepare, not to leave, not to run, but to pass it forward. Not the book itself, but the knowledge of its presence, the reason for its hiding, the truth of what it meant to guard something, not for power or pride, but for the belief that not all wisdom belongs to those who shout the loudest. You did not name it, not to Kieran, not to anyone, but you began to tell him stories, old ones, half-remembered parables that danced around fire and theft and the weight of unseen things. He listened without questioning. He absorbed your pauses as part of the meaning. He learned the shape of what was not said. Until one night, as he sat across from you near the hearth, he said, "Not everything that burns is lost." And you knew then that he would be ready. Weeks later, your breath grew shallow, not from illness, but from something deeper, an exhaustion not of the body but of years, of holding the weight of something sacred without release. When the morning bell rang and you did not rise, they found you seated, hands folded, robes still neat, eyes closed as if listening to a voice long buried. They buried you behind the garden, as was the custom. Ciaran helped carry the stretcher, though no tears fell. He kept the silence as you had taught him. That night, after the others had returned to prayer, he walked the same path you once had, barefoot, quiet, invisible, to the shelf in the cold scriptorium where the air no longer remembered fire but had never forgotten loss. He sat, not to lift the boards, but to place his hand over them. In that moment, the weight passed, not released, not relinquished, but shared, the way a candle shares light without growing dim. The book remained where you left it, untouched, unseen, waiting. Not for readers, but for guardians. For the ones who understood that sometimes the truest faith is not in revealing, but in protecting. The snow melted late that year, and the thaw left behind a slick of mud along the cloister paths, the kind that swallowed sandals and made the earth smell older than it should, like rot and rain and things not yet born. Ciaran walked those paths carefully, as you once had, his head bowed not in shame or submission, but in thought, in the way a man walks when the questions are larger than the answers, and silence feels more honest than speech. Though the others had begun to trust him, to nod when he passed and ask after his health in the refectory, he remained apart. Not aloof, not proud, just quiet and deliberate. A man who had learned from someone long gone how to carry something too sacred to speak aloud. The scriptorium was no longer forbidden, but no one lingered there long. Not since the fire. Not since the old shelves were replaced with newer ones, cleaner, simpler, less likely to hide things that might disrupt the world's tidy rhythms, and yet Ciaran still sat there, often alone, copying psalms he already knew by heart, his hands steady, his eyes fixed. Sometimes, though no one noticed, his fingers would drift toward the shelf, grazing the grain of the wood with the reverence of one touching a grave. Though he never opened the boards, he knew they still held it. The book, the presence, the promise, the thing that pulsed faintly beneath the floor as if it were part of the monastery's breath itself. Time moved differently after you were gone, not slower or faster, just thinner, as if the air between days had lost its density. Ciaran filled that space with purpose, tending the gardens you once passed through, retrying the herb bundles you once dried by the fire, reading in the same chair near the hearth where you once shared your final story without saying what it meant. The others began to turn to him, not as a leader, for the abbey already had one, but as a keeper of things, not just books, but moods, tensions, moments of memory that only he seemed able to catch before they slipped away. He began to notice more, phrases in texts that didn't match their translations, marginalia scratched out too quickly, hymns with verses no one had taught him. He followed them, not with suspicion, but with quiet curiosity. The kind that does not seek to expose, but to understand. One night, while reorganising a bundle of old vellum in the archive room, he found a fragment tucked beneath a sheet of psalms, a page written in a script he did not know. Not Latin, not Greek. Curved and coiled in a way that stirred something ancient in his chest. Though he said nothing, he took it to his cell, unfolded it beneath candlelight, sat with it until the flame burned down and the wax cooled. The page was no clearer than it had been at first glance, but still it stayed with him, the way grief does, or love, or a voice remembered not for its words, but for the hush that followed. Days later, a scholar arrived from the city, thin and pale and smelling of ink and salt. The abbot welcomed him with a long speech about restoration and history and order. But Ciaran watched the scholar's eyes, how they moved across the walls, how they lingered on the firewood stacked near the scriptorium door, how his fingers trembled slightly as he unrolled his parchment and asked politely if any unusual manuscripts had survived the old collection's purging. The abbot said no, of course, with a smile practised over years of politics. But Ciaran felt the shift, the same kind of shift he had once seen in your silence. He knew the book beneath the boards was no longer forgotten by everyone. That night, when the moon was low and the courtyard still, Ciaran returned to the shelf, just as you once had, barefoot, slow, invisible. He knelt beside it, not to lift the book, but to listen, to see if its silence had changed. Though the boards were cool and still, he sensed something beneath them, something awake, as if the book itself had heard the question and now waited for the answer. He did not touch it, not yet. The next day he asked to work in the garden alone. While digging through the frostbitten soil, he unearthed a broken hinge, rusted and old, not belonging to any of the abbey's doors. He cleaned it, kept it, not for use, but for meaning, as if it too had once hidden something worth protecting. The scholar stayed for days, asking questions framed as flattery, wandering too freely, making notes in a journal he never let out of his sight. Kieran remained polite, helpful, always one step ahead. Sweeping before the man arrived, placing unimportant texts in his path, deflecting with the kind of grace learned not from orders but from watchfulness. When the scholar finally left, empty-handed and slightly bitter, Kieran lit a candle in the chapel, not out of triumph, but gratitude. He stood there long after the wax had spilled down its base. He did not believe himself heroic, or holy, or even brave. He simply understood what it meant to keep something alive by not exposing it to light too harsh to bear. Over the years, he became what you had once been, though no one named him that. No ceremony marked the shift. When the next novice came, a boy with quick eyes and ink-stained fingers, Kieran watched him the way you once watched him. He waited. When the boy asked his first forbidden question, Kieran answered not with rules but with a story, one about silence and fire, and a book that no longer had a name. The novice listened, wide-eyed, and said nothing. In that moment, something passed again. Not information, not instruction, but something older and truer. The book remained beneath the floor, its script unread, its pages untouched, its message unspoken, but its meaning alive, in the quiet, in the breath between bells, in the stillness of hands that understood what it meant to guard not just what is written, but what is felt when the world forgets how to listen. The rains came hard the following spring, and with them came the sound of stone giving way behind the east cloister, where the wall had stood unexamined for decades. Its foundation had softened by time and the constant trickle of runoff from the roof above. The collapse was not catastrophic, but it was loud, and it drew everyone from their cells and their prayers into the open courtyard. Mist and silence hung in the air like a held breath. Kieran stood among them, arms folded, eyes fixed not on the rubble, but on what it revealed, a hollow space no wider than a man's shoulders, bricked long ago and sealed with layers of plaster that crumbled under the weight of water and memory. Inside, beneath the fallen stones and soot-stained dust, were shelves, or what remained of them, charred and blackened beams stacked with ash. But they were not entirely empty. Near the back of the cavity, untouched by fire or time, lay a single wooden box. It was narrow and bound in rusted clasps, the kind used not for storage but for safeguarding, for keeping something in rather than keeping things out. The monk stood in silence, unsure whether to step closer. It was the abbot who finally gestured forward, nodding for Kieran to inspect it. And so he did, kneeling with slow precision, not with fear, but with a weight in his chest he had not felt since the day you died. It was a sense that something was changing, not ending, but crossing over. As he brushed the dust from the box's lid and pried it open with steady hands, he found inside not relics or gold or bones, but scrolls, 3 of them, wrapped in leather and marked with faded symbols that seemed both familiar and foreign, curved lines and slashes that echoed the shapes he had once studied by candlelight in secret. Though he said nothing and no awe passed his face, the abbot must have sensed something. He cleared his throat and said, "Let it be brought to the scriptorium." The box was carried slowly and with great care into the room where centuries of ink had once flowed like water. It was laid upon the same table where you had once sat, where Kieran now copied daily the words of those long dead. He watched as the abbot called for the scholar, the same man who had come years before and left with questions unanswered. When the man arrived, paler now, his hair thinner and his hands still ink-stained and precise, he bowed not to the abbot, but to the box, as if he had known it would surface one day and had simply waited for the world to catch up. They opened the scrolls together, not all at once, but carefully, day by day. The monastery grew quiet again. Not the quiet of ritual, but the quiet of tension, of something sleeping and disturbed, of truths too large for language and too old for comfort. Kieran watched, always just outside the candle's edge, never intruding, but never far. What he saw troubled him, not the texts themselves, but the way the scholar's face changed as he read them. His expression grew tight, almost reverent, almost afraid. The abbot, once confident and composed, began to withdraw from the process. He allowed the scholar to work alone late into the night, while the brothers whispered that perhaps the scrolls were cursed, or perhaps they were a test, or perhaps they were never meant to be found at all. Kieran did not speak those fears aloud, but he felt them, not as doubt, but as pressure. A gathering weight behind his ribs that grew heavier with each passing day. One night, when the wind outside moaned against the windows and the scholar's candle flickered erratically, Kieran stepped forward and asked gently, "What have they told you?" The man looked up with eyes that had not blinked in hours and said only, "They remember everything," before closing the scroll and excusing himself without another word. That night Kieran did not sleep. By morning the scholar was gone, his quarters were stripped of notes, his journal missing. The scrolls were locked in a cabinet none of the brothers had seen before, guarded by a key the abbot would not speak of. In the weeks that followed, the abbey fell into a hush deeper than prayer, a hush of holding, of waiting, of silence laced with unease. Kieran, though still respected, was no longer consulted, not because he had erred, but because the air around him now held the scent of knowledge too near the flame. So he returned to the rhythm you had once taught him, to the garden, to the firewood, to the candlelit hours in the scriptorium when no one else remained. In those hours he sat near the hidden shelf, his hand resting as always on the boards that never shifted. He whispered, not to the book, but to you, to the memory of the man who once showed him how silence could be stronger than any name, and he said, "They are looking in the wrong place." The boards beneath his palm felt warm as if they agreed. The months passed. Though the scrolls remained locked and the scholar never returned, the abbey slowly healed. Not in certainty, but in function, in prayer, in days that began and ended on time. In that space, Kieran began again to train the novices. He spoke in stories. He guided with half answers and full presence. Though he never told them of the book, or the boards, or the night you handed him everything without touching a thing, he taught them how to see, how to watch the space between questions, how to feel what is not said, how to understand that preservation is not hiding but honouring. In time, he watched one of them sit by the shelf as he once had, not knowing what lay beneath it, only that it mattered, only that something sacred lingered there. In that moment, Kieran knew his part was ending, not because it failed, but because it was complete. One night, many years later, long after the walls had been patched and the scrolls forgotten, he folded his robe. He placed his sandals by the basin. He walked barefoot into the dark, not away, not in shame, but in peace, knowing that what was meant to be kept had been kept, and what was meant to be passed had found its way into new hands. The book, still buried, still silent, remained as it always had, not lost, not unread, simply waiting, waiting for the one who would one day understand it, not with the eyes but with the heart, and recognize in its silence the sound of something sacred, something old, something true. The abbey still stood, though the world beyond its gates had changed beyond recognition. Roads once paved by cart and boot were now softened with silence, and the town that once rang with bells and barter had emptied of its urgency, its noise replaced by the hush of lives grown slower, gentler, or lost. No more pilgrims came, no more scholars knocked. The old abbot's chair sat vacant, draped in linen to catch the dust, and the younger brothers tended the hours not with fervour but with rhythm. The scrolls remained in their cabinet, still locked, the key long buried beneath generations of quiet command. No one had asked about them in years. No one had dared. But in the scriptorium, where the mortar still bore the faint heat of centuries past, the boards beneath the far shelf still held their shape, and the book, wrapped in cedar cloth, untouched by air, remained in its silence. A new novice arrived, lean and wide-eyed, sent not by calling but by the hand of an uncle who wished to see the boy cured of his restlessness. He arrived sceptical, carrying more questions than clothes, and his first weeks passed in muttered sarcasm and late awakenings. But he had clever hands, and when assigned to mend the garden fence he did so without complaint. It was Ciaran's successor who watched him most. Not the abbot, not the elders, but a quiet monk with soft fingers and eyes that measured more than they revealed. This monk had no title beyond brother, but his presence shaped the abbey's current like a riverbank, subtle, strong, unseen. He began assigning the boy small tasks, brushing ash from the hearth, folding the prayer cloths, copying slowly the simpler chants. The boy grew quieter, not because he had changed, but because something within him had been given space to listen. And one morning, while tending the scriptorium, he asked, "Why is there a shelf we never use?" The monk did not flinch. He only looked at the shelf, then at the boy, and replied, "Some shelves hold more than books." That was the end of it for a time. Seasons passed. The boy stayed. His restlessness faded into curiosity, and his curiosity softened into discipline. He read late, walked early, and once, after a strong wind shook loose a tile from the chapel roof, he climbed without being asked to replace it. That winter he spent long hours beside the fire, hands wrapped around a mug of herb broth, eyes drifting often to the corners of the room, as if the walls might speak if he only stared long enough. He had not been told any story, not of the fire, not of the scholar, not of the scrolls or the book. But still he sensed something. Still he felt the weight in the air that only lives where truth is hidden, but not forgotten. One night the monk found him seated beside the shelf, not touching it, not asking, just there, breathing, waiting. The monk sat beside him. Neither spoke. The fire crackled. The night held. And in that moment the boy understood that whatever lay beneath was not meant to be disturbed, but known, carried, witnessed. In the weeks that followed, his lessons changed. He was taught how to brew teas from herbs not listed in the official books. He was given a text to copy that did not exist in the main archive. He was told stories whose endings were never explained. He did not question it. He only listened. And slowly, without ceremony, the torch passed again. Years later, long after that boy had become a man and the monk had returned to dust, the abbey received a letter. It came wrapped in oilskin, addressed in a hand none could place. Inside was a page, a single leaf of vellum. Upon it, written in ink the colour of blood-dark wine, were the first 5 lines of the book beneath the shelf. Not copied, but rewritten, translated, preserved. No one knew who sent it. No one ever claimed its origin. But its presence confirmed what had always been quietly hoped, that the book had not been forgotten, that its meaning had outlived its pages. That memory, when guarded with care and carried through silence, could survive anything. The scrolls remained locked. The shelf remained undisturbed. But those who lived within the abbey walls walked softer, prayed longer, listened more. And in the quietest hours, when the wind stirred through the cloister and the moon cast its light across the worn stone floors, someone always passed through the scriptorium, not to read, not to write, but to sit beside the shelf, hand resting lightly on the boards, heart beating to the rhythm of a history not recorded but remembered. There, in the stillness, where centuries breathed together and time folded into itself, the book remained. Not for fame, not for glory, not for rebellion or revolution, but because someone once chose to save what others would have burned, because someone listened when others forgot how, because silence, when held with love, becomes legacy, and because beneath all the noise and forgetting of the world, something sacred waits always to be found again. You do not speak when you enter. No one does. The vow begins in silence, and it ends in blood. The gate is not locked, but no one comes here by mistake. The stone path winds behind the chapel, past the cemetery where names have worn away, and where the wind smells of iron and smoke. The door is narrow, the lintel low. You must bow to pass through. This is not for humility. It is a warning. The walls are thick and candlelit, the air heavy with sweat and oil, and as you cross the threshold you hear it. Not chanting, not prayer, but breath. Controlled, measured. Human breath held just long enough to mean something. They stand in a circle when you arrive, robes dark with ash, belts of braided rope coiled at the waist like serpents, bare feet on cold stone. None look at you, none move. A bell rings, not far but muffled. The abbot stands behind them, his hand raised not in welcome but in command, and you kneel, as instructed, placing your hands palm down on the floor. It is not about submission, it is about presence. You must feel the ground that has caught so much blood and not recoil. You must become part of it. One by one the brothers move, robes rustling like dry leaves. A bowl of water is placed before you. Cold. You wash. A cloth is handed to you. You wipe your hands, then your eyes, then your mouth. They are not purifying your body. They are severing your voice. Your eyes will see only what must be seen. Your mouth will speak only when bidden. A scroll is unrolled. You do not read it aloud. You read it in your heart. The vows are simple. You will serve. You will obey. You will not question pain when it comes from discipline. You will not cry out unless the cry is for another. You will not hold back your blade when it is needed. You will not raise it in pride. You will bleed so others may not. You will kneel so others may stand. You will carry sin without casting it. You will be as stone, as fire, as rope, as ash. There is no applause, no welcome, only the hiss of a torch and the drip of something behind the walls. You are given a robe, black, coarse, too heavy for warmth, too light for modesty. You wrap it over your shoulders and feel its weight settle not on your skin but in your chest. They lead you to the inner cloister, where no prayers are spoken aloud. There are tools here, whips, brands, blades not for killing but for reminding. The walls bear marks, not carvings, not symbols, but streaks of soot and blood and something older. You will learn them, not now, soon. Your bed is straw, your food is silent. No bread is broken in joy, every bite is a lesson. Hunger is holy, fullness is folly. The bell rings again, this one sharper. You rise and follow the others to the chamber below. A circular room, hollowed from rock, lit by sconces that do not flicker. The air is warm here, too warm. You sweat before you descend the final stair. The brothers form a circle once more. One steps forward. He removes his robe. Beneath it, his back is scarred with lines that cross and recross, as if history itself had been written on his skin. He kneels. Another steps behind him. A whip is taken from the wall. It is not ceremonial. It is not performed. It is given. 3 lashes, not hard, not soft, just enough. The brother does not flinch. The room does not react. You are told it is penance, not for sin committed, but for sin witnessed. The world sins. You suffer. That is the exchange. That is the vow. You leave the chamber changed, not because of what you saw, but because you did not stop it. You did not question it. You did not turn away. The weeks that follow are full of quiet discipline. You rise before the sun. You wash with cold water. You copy scripture not with ink, but by carving it into thin strips of wood, each stroke a punishment for thoughtlessness. You're not here to understand. You're here to remember, to endure, to protect. The brotherhood does not exist in the records of the abbey. No guest is ever told. No scribe is ever admitted. You are spoken of only when needed, and even then only in warning. Do not lie in the chapel, they say. The ones behind the wall are listening. You do not correct them. You do not wish to be known. That is part of the work. You are taken, after your third week, to the cliff path. It winds above the village, past the execution field where wooden stakes still rot in the grass. You are told to kneel. You do. A brother speaks. He names a sin not yours. Theft, murder, betrayal. It does not matter. You are to kneel for it. You are to carry it. You are to fast for 2 days and return without complaint. You do. You are cold, you are weak, but you do not falter. When you return, the others nod, not in praise, but in recognition. You are learning, you are becoming. One night a brother does not return from the penance path. His sandals are found near the river, his robe snagged on a thorn. He is not mourned, he is remembered. A single candle is lit in the chamber below. The room smells of iron that night. You do not ask why. That is not your place. You are assigned to copy his texts. You find in them not words, but scratches. Marks made by pressure, not thought. He was in pain, but he did not ask for help. That is the vow. You add your own lines. You do not cry. One morning you are called to the sanctuary before sunrise. A guest has arrived. A nobleman. Arrogant. Gold chain around his neck. He demands confession from the high abbot. He does not recognize your robes. He sneers. He lies. You know this. You see it in his face. The abbot listens. He nods. He gestures to you. You do not speak. You step forward. The nobleman flinches. He is escorted to the gate. He does not return. You do not ask what he confessed. You do not ask what he did. You only stand watch beside the altar for the next 3 nights, in silence, in heat, in stillness. You begin to understand. Pain is not the point. Pain is the reminder. You carry it so others don't have to. You remember the vow. To kneel so others may stand, to bleed so others may not. Your back begins to carry the history of the brotherhood, not by punishment, but by right. You feel the marks when you lie down. You feel them when you wake. They are not scars. They are text. They are truth. You have not spoken in weeks. Your voice is not missed. Your silence is a presence. One day a child is brought to the gate. He has stolen bread. The priest says he should be whipped. The abbot shakes his head. You are sent instead. You take the boy to the garden. You give him a shovel. You say nothing. He digs. He sweats. He finishes. You nod. He bows. He leaves. That night, you carve his name into wood, beneath your own. A new vow. A new memory. You understand now. The blade is not for wrath. It is for witness. The fire is not for punishment. It is for purification. The blood is not spilled for anger. It is poured in silence so the world might sleep, never knowing what was spared. The days began to blend, not from boredom, but from repetition so complete that time no longer passed. It folded. You moved through each hour by instinct, not memory. You no longer measured your worth by how much you spoke, but by how deeply you listened. The wind had changed, not outside, inside, in the cloister, in the stone, in the breath of the walls that once merely stood but now seemed to watch. You had become one of them, not by proclamation, but by absorption. The brotherhood did not welcome you, it consumed you. Your name, once spoken aloud, now lived only in the margins of prayer cards. Your face, once reflected in the silver basin near the refectory door, no longer startled you when it showed new lines, new wear, new absence. You'd forgotten what you looked like before the robe, before the vow. You still remembered the world outside, but only as one remembers a fever. Real, but no longer trustworthy. You no longer missed it. You no longer feared it. What you feared now in the deepest parts of your night was not noise, but the breaking of silence. Because silence was where you knew yourself, where you communed, where you could hear the ache of a brother kneeling in the far hallway, the tremor of breath held too long, the flinch that followed the first lash, not of pain, but of release. The brotherhood taught that discipline was not cruelty, it was clarity. Pain, well used, was a scalpel. It cut away illusion. Your training changed in the third season. You were led to a chamber deeper than the others, beneath the sanctuary, where the ceiling was low and the walls bore carvings older than your order. Here, the air did not move. Here, breath felt borrowed. A single brazier burned in the centre, casting shadows like hands on every surface. You were not told its name. You were only told to kneel. You obeyed. From the shadows came a figure in robes dyed not black but grey, older than ash. This was the keeper. You had heard the title whispered but never seen it worn. He spoke only once. You're here to remember what we have tried not to forget. Then he unrolled a scroll on the floor. It was not scripture. It was not even a language you knew, but you understood it. Not with the mind, with the marrow. The symbols were pain, transformed. They told of a village burned because a brother warned too late. A child lost because a brother failed to act. A secret kept so long that it poisoned its keeper. Each line was a vow made by someone who had failed and returned to promise again. The keeper pointed to one symbol, an open circle, and said, "This one is yours now." He handed you a knife. Not sharp, just honest. You did not flinch as you carved the symbol into your upper arm. The blood came slowly. It was not the pain that changed you. It was the weight. You were now part of the vow. That night you did not sleep. You walked the cloister alone, not for comfort, but for anchoring. You counted your steps not to calm yourself, but to match the cadence of the chant you had never learned but now knew. Every 28 steps, a whisper. Not yours, the walls, the stones, the ones before you. You were not the first to walk this path. You would not be the last. At dawn, you were sent beyond the walls, not far, just to the edge of the wood. There you met a woman, old, blind, her hands wrapped in cloth. You said nothing. She handed you a satchel. Inside, folded cloth, herbs, and a single feather. You bowed. She touched your cheek. "For the next one," she said. You returned without speaking. You placed the feather in the chamber of vows. No one asked. No one needed to. Symbols were the language of the Brotherhood, and yours had begun to speak. Later that week, a messenger arrived from the city. Pale, rushed, terrified. His master, a magistrate, had taken ill after ordering a dozen men hanged for theft. He heard voices in the night. He clawed at his skin. He wept over a bucket of ashes that was once a ledger. The bishop would not see him. The physicians fled. They asked for your abbot. The abbot asked for you. You travelled at dusk, alone, robed, barefoot. You found the man tied to his own bed, screaming in languages too new to be old and too old to be new. You stood beside him until he saw you. He stilled. You said nothing. You opened the satchel. Herbs, cloth, the feather. You wrapped his hands in silence. He asked what you were. You said, "A mirror." Then you left. He didn't die. But he was never again whole. You returned to the abbey and carved a second mark below the first. A circle within a circle. One for you, one for him. The next season you were sent to the crypt, alone, no explanation. There, you found a book, bound in hide. No title, only breath. You opened it to find nothing but pages stained with oil and time. No words, only space. You wrote nothing. You did not need to. That was the test. Can you hold the void and not fill it? Can you bear witness without speaking? You returned the book. You bowed. You were ready. The final rite was not spoken of, only felt. You were told to go to the chamber below on the night when no moon rose. You did. There the keeper waited. So did 3 others. Brothers. You knew them only by silence. Each carried a torch. You were told to kneel. You did. The keeper removed your robe. You felt no shame, only lightness. You were given a brand, a single iron mark, placed above your heart. It burned. You did not scream. You did not cry. You whispered, Let it be known I did not turn away." The others repeated it. The keeper nodded. The torches were extinguished. You left the chamber new, not reborn, just more true. In the weeks after, your duties changed. You now walked among the villagers when the sun was low. You listened to those who spoke with no one else. You watched the edges of truth. You carried stories like stones, heavy and shaping. You were given no titles, no rewards, just a silence deeper than before. You had become the blade that does not gleam, the fire that does not rage, the rope that does not bind but holds. You had become the vow. One day, a boy asked you why you walked barefoot. You said, "So the earth remembers I was here." He nodded. He understood. You wrote his name in the book with no ink. The betrayal did not begin with a scream. It began with a cough. Software dismissed. A brother fell ill during morning vigil, his breath catching mid-prayer, his hands trembling as he bowed. It was not the illness that unsettled the room. It was the silence that followed. He was taken to the infirmary, attended by 2 novices who had never once questioned the vow, but had not yet learned its full burden. They wiped his brow. They poured cool water over his feet. They said nothing. But that night, as the bell rang for Compline, the younger of the 2 left the corridor before the final toll. He did not return until dawn. When asked, he said he had been in the herb cellar, that the monk had worsened, that he had done what he could. No one pressed. But the other novice, quiet, careful, always watching, did not sleep that night. The next morning the elder brother was dead, peaceful, undisturbed. But something in the air had changed. Not fear, not grief, expectation. As if the walls were waiting for a name to be spoken and knew it would not come easily. You had not tended the ill, but you were summoned. Not because you were a healer, because you were a listener. The abbot asked nothing. He placed a small candle on your palm. "Watch what the flame leans toward," he said. That night you lit it in the dormitory. It flickered, pulled slightly toward the younger novice's bed. You said nothing. You waited. The next evening you placed the candle on the altar. It leaned again, toward the rear exit, the path that led not to the herb cellar, but to the forbidden well. The old one, the one sealed long ago. That night you followed. The well was not hidden, just ignored, covered with a flat stone and overgrown with a moss. But you found the footprints, not recent, but deep, as if someone had knelt there, waited. The moss had been disturbed, scraped away in a crescent. You traced your hand along the stone, cold, drier than it should be. The seal had been broken and replaced, not in haste, with care. You did not lift it, not yet. You returned at first light with the abbot. He said nothing when he saw, only closed his eyes and whispered, "Then it begins again." You were instructed to gather the brotherhood. Not all, only the ones marked by fire. They came. You stood in a circle beside the well. The stone was lifted. Beneath it, not water, wood. A ladder, descending. The keeper arrived last. He carried a pouch. Inside, charcoal, salt, a feather blackened by soot. "If you descend," he said, "you do not return as you were." You did not hesitate, you descended first. The passage was narrow, carved from rock and memory. The air smelled of rust and sap. You held your breath until it burned. The chamber below was round, lit by torches set into alcoves long unused. At its centre a basin, not of water, of ash. You recognised the symbols carved around its rim, each one a vow that had once been broken, each one etched by those who had failed to carry their silence cleanly. The others joined you. The abbot remained above. The keeper stepped forward. He lifted a chain from his neck and dropped it into the ash. "One of us has offered knowledge to those who would use it for power." The room did not shift. The torches did not flicker. But your pulse changed. You knew, not because of evidence, because of stillness. The silence around the younger novice had grown too clean, too practiced, not true silence, concealment. The keeper continued. A page was taken. one from the Book of No Ink. It has appeared in the hands of a bishop who claims divine insight no monk has seen. The words are ours. The marks, yours. His eyes were on you. You did not flinch. I have not failed, you said. But I know who did. You returned to the ladder. You did not wait for instruction. You climbed to the surface, barefoot and steady. The novice was in the garden, tending rosemary. You approached slowly. He saw you. He did not run. He stood, hands empty. He spoke first. It was just a page. No one reads it. No one remembers. You shook your head. It is not meant to be remembered. It is meant to be kept. He laughed, soft, bitter. Kept by whom? Those who forget their names? You stepped closer. By those who remember what silence is worth. He reached into his robe and pulled out the page, folded, unmarked, as if it had never held weight. But you saw it. The edge, burned clean. The mark you had carved years ago, faint but there. He offered it to you. I only wanted to be seen, he said. You took the page. You did not scold. You turned. He did not follow. That night he left. No words, no punishment, no return. The brotherhood gathered once more. The page was placed into the ash basin. It was consumed without fire. The silence deepened. You were called to the keeper's chamber. He handed you a scroll, blank. Write nothing, he said, and just carry it. You bowed. You returned to your quarters. The scroll sat at your bedside for 13 days. On the 14th, you dreamed of the well. In your dream, it whispered your name. You woke. The scroll was gone. In its place, a feather, whole and white. No soot, no burn. The message was clear. You had chosen to protect, not punish, to guard, not destroy. Weeks passed. The rituals resumed. The chamber below was sealed. The novices were reminded of their place, not by word but by rhythm. Those who listened stayed. Those who questioned were sent elsewhere. You continued your walks, your fasts, your silent vigils. But something in you had shifted. Not broken. Broadened. You understood now that the vow was not about control. It was about stewardship, about holding what others could not carry, even if it meant being invisible while doing it. You sat beside the book with no ink. You did not open it. You did not write. You only placed your hand on its cover and whispered, still. The book did not respond, but your heart did. Years later, when you were old, and the mark above your heart had faded into a pale memory, a young monk came to you. He did not ask questions. He did not need to. He simply placed a blank scroll on your lap and said, "It is ready." You smiled. You stood. You walked to the chamber below. You opened the door that should not have remembered you. It did. Inside, the ash basin was cold, the torches unlit. You placed the scroll in the centre. You sat and you waited. For nothing. For everything. For silence to carry on without your breath. The vow did not end when your knees stiffened or your hands lost their grip on the scroll. It did not end when you no longer rose at dawn, or when your breath slowed to the rhythm of old stone walls cooling in twilight. The vow was not kept in the body. It was kept in the silence, and the silence now was everywhere. You no longer walked the full cloister path. Your steps had shortened, but the novices still moved aside when you passed, not out of fear, out of memory. You had become the weight they measured their days against, the reminder that vows are not proven in voice or spectacle, but in stillness repeated so often it becomes a kind of truth. Your room was smaller now, closer to the west wall, a cell once used for winter meditation. The wind tapped against it at night like a knuckle asking a question. You answered only by sitting with it. In those final months you kept no parchment, no quill. Your hands were too unsteady, but you taught with presence. You showed the younger ones how to thread silence through routine, how to remove themselves from a space without absence, how to be where needed without being noticed. They learned. You watched. You breathed. On a morning painted in fog, the keeper came to you. He did not speak. He handed you a cloth folded and bound with twine. You opened it slowly. Inside, a feather newly white and a scrap of leather etched with a single symbol. The open circle, the one you had carved into your own flesh all those years ago. Beneath it, a second symbol, unfamiliar but echoing yours, a child of it, an evolution. You looked up. The keeper nodded. He has taken the walk. You closed your eyes and said, then the vow lives. That night you walked to the threshold of the lower chamber for the last time. You did not descend. You only touched the stone with your fingertips and bowed. Behind you, one of the young monks waited, his face open, quiet. You did not speak. You did not need to. You placed the feather in his hand. He wept without sound. The seasons turned slowly after that. You no longer tracked time. You did not mark feast days or solstices. You simply woke and watched. The garden outside your window grew full, then brown, then bare, then full again. The same brothers moved in patterns you had once known by heart. You began to forget names, not out of failure, but out of surrender. The vow had never been about knowing. It had been about holding, about bearing, about staying when no one else would, and you had stayed. One evening, as the light dimmed and the walls turned amber, you sat at your low table, hands folded, and you felt the breath in your chest shift. Not stop. Change. You knew then. You stood once more. Only once. You walked to the scriptorium. No one saw you enter. The room was empty. You placed your hand on the spine of the book with no ink. You whispered the same word you'd given it years before. Still. Then you sat beside it. Your breath slowed. Your eyes closed. You leaned your head against the wood, and you waited. They found you before matins, peaceful, still seated, still present. The candle beside you had burned all the way down. No wax remained, only the wick, curled and clean. They did not lift you. They did not speak. One monk closed the door. Another lit a new candle and placed it beside your hand. The abbot came later. He stood in the doorway. He removed his sandals. He knelt. He bowed his head. The vow is kept, he said, and the brothers repeated it. The vow is kept. You were not buried in the cemetery. You were buried beside the well. The stone was not marked. The moss was not removed. But each year, on the night with no moon, a brother would walk the path, barefoot, carrying only a scroll bound in twine and a single white feather. He would stand beside the stone, bow once, then return. Nothing was spoken, no name recorded, no memory named. But something lived in that silence, something deeper than story, stronger than rule, the vow. Long after the abbey's name was forgotten by maps, after its towers crumbled and its bells fell silent, the scrolls remained. Some survived fire, some were buried, some passed hand to hand, mistaken for poetry, for madness, for myth. But in each, a pattern, a circle, an opening, a silence folded into symbol. The vow did not end. It changed shape. It lived in the quiet courage of a boy who returned a stolen loaf without excuse, in the soldier who bandaged a wound before raising his blade, in the old woman who said, "You can sit here," without asking questions. The brotherhood never died. It vanished, not in defeat, in victory. The vow was never meant to conquer. It was meant to outlast, to breathe beneath, to hold still while the world moved. And if one day you find yourself beside a well that shouldn't be there, where the wind sounds like a breath waiting to be heard, and the moss peels back too easily, and your hand rests on a stone that feels warm in the cold, you may not find a ladder, you may not find ash, but you may find a feather, folded, white, waiting, and you will know. The vow was never about who kept it, only that it was kept. The inkstone had been used so many times it no longer felt cold. It warmed beneath his hand, as familiar as a prayer. Morning light spilled into the archive in ribbons, thin, golden, filtered through dust and the lacquered slats of the high windows. He did not rush. The first hour of the day was for water, for tea, for grinding the ink. The silence in the archive was never empty. It was full of soft sounds. The brush bristle tapping the rim of the porcelain dish, the quiet exhale before setting down the first stroke, the groan of paper as it curled and dried. His name was Gian, but no one used it. In the court records he was simply Keeper. A humble title, but not an empty one. His work was not to write, but to copy, exactly, reverently, without embellishment. The Emperor's library was vast, and Gian had lived long enough to touch almost every scroll in it. He had no children, no wife. But his memory was crowded with names of poets, ministers, healers, generals long turned to dust. His brush carried them forward, stroke by careful stroke. He did not speak as he worked. There was no one left to speak to. The younger scribes had been reassigned to military offices. Others had fled, some simply stopped returning. But Gian stayed. He had always stayed. Even when the rumours came. Even when the courier from Chang'an arrived in the night and left again before dawn. Even when the rice shipment failed to come. The scroll still needed to breathe. The words still needed hands. That spring, the air held a new kind of weight. Not heat, not dust. Expectation. The guards at the palace gate were nervous, their eyes darting more often toward the hills than the streets. Travellers spoke of roads blocked, of border towns vanishing without sound. Ian did not ask questions, he only wrote. But one morning, the head steward entered the archive, a man who had never once crossed the threshold in 30 years, and spoke 6 words. The Emperor has issued an order. Gian looked up but did not rise. The steward hesitated, then handed him a scroll sealed in wax. Gian broke it carefully. The wax snapped like old bone. Inside, a decree to purge all texts not aligned with the needs of the new age. He read it twice, then a third time. The characters did not change. He looked to the shelves. Over 7,000 scrolls, medical treatises, maps of rivers that no longer flowed. Poems written by widows, journals of banished generals, secrets whispered in brush strokes. "When?" he asked. The steward did not answer. He only bowed and left. Gian sat in stillness long after the light shifted. He did not weep. He did not speak. But his heart made a sound he had never heard before. Not a break, a tightening. As if the threads that held him to the world were drawing inward, preparing to hold fast. That night, he did not sleep. He lit a single lantern. He unrolled each scroll one by one and ran his fingers along their edges. He whispered their titles like prayers. The uses of winter roots, the star positions in the year of red rain, the customs of the river people. When he reached the last row, he paused. There was one scroll he had copied himself, years ago, not for the court. For a woman who had brought it to him wrapped in silk, asking only that it survive. He had rewritten it 3 times, once for her, once for the archive, once for himself. It was a story, a small one, about a child who returned to a river that no longer flowed and found something growing where the water had been. Jean had never forgotten the lines. Even dry soil remembers rain. That scroll lay beneath his cot, unmarked, unnumbered. He lit a second lantern. At sunrise he began the burnings. Officially. He opened the doors. He selected scrolls at random. He brought them to the courtyard. The guards watched. They said nothing. Flames rose. Smoke gathered in his robe. But each night he returned to the archive and copied. Not everything. Only one scroll each night. The ones that would vanish. The ones no one else would think to save. He used old silk, slips of bark, even the backs of tax ledgers. He hid them in pots, in cracks behind the shelves, in the hollow frame of a broken ceremonial drum. The days grew louder. The city tensed. Scribes from other provinces arrived, carrying their own burdens. Some stayed to help. Most did not. Jian remained. He moved slower now. His fingers shook, but his lines were steady. One morning he found a scroll already half burned on his desk. Not by him, by someone else. It was poetry, a single couplet still legible. I wrapped the wind in silk and sent it to you. He stared at it for a long time. Not for the words, for the intention. Someone had sent a message, not to warn, to mourn. That night Jian added another hiding place, beneath the altar in the archive's shrine, where no one ever looked, where even the dust moved carefully. He placed the child's river story there, wrapped in oilcloth. He left a stone on top, not to weigh it down, to tell the stone, remember. The purges accelerated, boxes arrived from the outer provinces, scrolls deemed unfit, useless, dangerous. Jian was ordered to process them. He bowed. He accepted them. He did what he was told, but always he copied one more. He could not save them all. But one scroll is never only one. One scroll is a door, a seed, a breath held through fire. The wind shifted. The banners outside the palace changed. The old steward vanished. New voices echoed in the halls. Jian moved slower. His knees cracked when he knelt. He no longer remembered how many he had hidden. He only remembered their voices. Not loud, just present. One morning a boy arrived at the archive door. He said nothing. He only bowed. He returned each day. He brought no ink, only water. Jian said, on the third day, "You're too young to carry memory." The boy replied, "Then I will carry silence." Jian nodded. He handed him a brush. The boy returned each morning just after the dew had dried from the steps, but before the shadows retreated from the walls. He never knocked. He never called out. He only bowed once at the threshold and waited until Jian lifted his hand or shifted his chair, some small sign that the silence had accepted him. The boy carried no name the old scribe could remember, but he had quick eyes and a breath that moved evenly, the way paper does when it's being measured. Jian did not ask where he had come from or who had sent him. He only passed him a brush on the third day and gestured to the scroll beside him, not to copy, just to feel the weight of it. The boy held it as one might hold an egg still warm from the nest. His fingers curled lightly at the edge. Jian nodded. That was enough. They said nothing the first week. The second, Jian began to point, to a stroke made too fast, a dot missed, a margin too tight. The boy said nothing back, but he changed. He slowed. He watched the ink settle before lifting the brush. He began to understand that writing was not a task. It was a vow. Not to beauty, not even to meaning, to presence. The words they copied were old, some forbidden, some forgotten. Jian did not explain them. He did not need to. The boy began to know them by how they felt, not what they said. A certain character always made him pause, one that meant buried longing, another that meant to weep without sound. Jian's hands grew more tired. His brush slipped more often. He no longer trusted his eyes to read fine characters in the dusk. So the boy lit candles. He warmed the inkstone. He prepared the paper. Jian watched him move and remembered a time when he had done all those things for his own master. Back when the halls were filled with voices and the scrolls still wore fresh seals, and the palace garden bloomed with camellias that no one was allowed to pick. That garden was gone now, dug up to make space for the garrison storehouse. But Jian still smelled it sometimes, in dreams, in memory, in the steam that rose from his tea. The boy learned not just the letters, but the silences between them. He learned when to pause, when to breathe, when to fold a page and when to let it remain open to the wind. He learned to write so that the strokes did not disturb the sleeping dust. One evening, Jian placed a sealed scroll into the boy's hands. "This," he said, "is not to be read. Only protected." The boy looked down at it, then up. Jian's eyes were tired, not sad, just full. "Where?" the boy asked. Jian pointed to the western alcove behind the stone with the missing corner. "There's a space. It will remember you." That night, after the boy had gone, Jian sat with a book of his own life. Not a book, truly, just a bundle of pages folded within cloth, tucked into a wooden tray. It held no title, only small things, names, dates, a pressed petal, a sketch of a teacup, a poem unfinished, the sound of rain recorded in brushstrokes that made no word at all. He read it as one reads a dream already forgotten, slowly, with wonder. He added one more line. A boy came and did not ask to stay. Then he closed the tray and slid it beneath his bed. The next morning he could not lift his brush. His hands shook too much. The boy arrived, saw the tremor, said nothing. He poured the ink, he dipped the brush. He placed Jian's hand in his, and together they made one word. Endure. Jian smiled. He slept through most of the afternoon. When he woke, the boy was gone. But a scroll had been placed beside his sleeping mat. Not one he recognized. It bore the child's hand, careful and uneven. A story of a man who planted a seed in a bowl of ink and waited for it to grow. Jian wept quietly, not because the story was good, but because it had no ending. That night he dreamed of the well in the northern courtyard, the one no one drew from because it was too deep, too cold. In the dream, the boy climbed down holding a scroll. When Jian woke, the world had shifted. He knew, not in dread, in completion. The next morning he asked the boy to light all the candles. He opened every scroll they had copied together. He laid them across the floor like a river, each line flowing into the next. He touched them one by one, then he spoke. You will carry what is not yours, not because it is owed to you, but because it would die without you. The boy nodded. Jian placed his hand over the boy's. They sat in the light until the ink dried and the paper cooled. That night, Jian did not sleep in his bed. He sat beside the hearth, eyes closed, hands folded. The boy watched him breathe, once, twice, then not again. He did not touch the old man. He did not weep. He stood. He gathered the scrolls. He folded the unfinished story into cloth. He placed it where the old man had pointed weeks before, behind the stone. Then he sealed the doors of the archive and walked out into the morning fog. The birds were quiet, the guards gone. The city waking to the sound of footsteps no one would follow. He walked not toward home, but toward remembering. The scrolls outlived the city, not by defiance, by quiet, by remaining still while everything else shifted. The boy, who had no name in the records, no title in the court, no family name etched in the great registry, became a part of the dust and stone that others stepped over without seeing. He returned to the archive, not as a visitor, not as a child, but as something older than his own bones. He did not open the doors with ceremony. He slid them aside at dawn, just as Jian had once done, and bowed to the silence inside as though it were a master still watching from the rafters. No one stopped him. There was no one left who remembered what had once been stored in those walls. The guards had gone, the scribes reassigned. The palace had lost interest in scrolls not useful to war or tax or decree. That suited him. The boy, now taller, slower, but still unread by the world, repaired the doors with his own hands. He patched the cracks in the roof. He swept the corners, not to clear them, but to know them. He unrolled the unfinished scrolls and completed only what he understood. The rest he left untouched, because some stories finished themselves in silence. The paper had begun to curl. The ink had faded in places, but he did not recopy them. He let them age, let them breathe, let them carry time as it was meant to be carried, without rush, without fear. The archive was no longer a library. It had become a chamber of echoes, and he was its pulse. Each morning he prepared the ink, even when he did not write. The scent grounded him. It reminded him that language begins before the first stroke. He sang nothing. He prayed only with his posture. When birds perched on the rafters, he whispered their names into the air, not so they would understand, but so he would not forget. He sharpened the stylus Jian once used, not because it would be needed again, but because honouring a tool is a form of memory. On the wall where scrolls had once been stacked floor to ceiling, he carved a single character each month. Not to preserve language, to speak to time. The words he chose were simple. Wait, turn, return, breathe, still. He added no explanation, only space. Winter came early one year. The snow began before the harvest was done. The roofs collapsed on the western quarter. The well froze. The boy slept with his hands tucked beneath his robe, brush tied to his wrist so he would not lose it in his sleep. He had grown into his silence now. It was no longer something he carried. It carried him. One night, a man from the north arrived. He wore armour under his robes and called himself a magistrate. He spoke loudly, demanded to know what remained in the archive, said he had orders to collect anything of value. The boy said nothing. He handed the man a scroll. Not an important one. A receipt for grain from 60 years prior. The man unrolled it, sneered, and left it behind. He did not return. The boy gathered the scroll, smoothed it flat, and placed it among the hidden ones. Even mundane memory has value. Years passed, seasons thickened, the inkpots cracked, the brushes frayed, the boy aged. His hair greyed not from years, but from waiting. He began to write less, not because there was nothing left, but because he had learned what Gian had known all along, that words are not always the best preservers, that sometimes the brush must rest so the story can breathe on its own. One morning he found a girl at the gate, small, barefoot, wrapped in the kind of linen peasants use for grain sacks. She said nothing, only stared at the rafters, then at him. He handed her a bowl of rice, a warm cloth, and a brush. She took them all without blinking. He watched her as she sat beside the fire, hands warming. He didn't ask her name. He did not need to. That night he opened the hidden alcove, took out Jian's scroll about the river child, and placed it beside her while she slept. She would find it. She would read it. She would know. When the old man woke the next morning, the girl was sitting beside the scroll, copying each word in silence. Her strokes were crooked, her lines uneven, but her attention was perfect. He smiled. He lit the lamp. He poured the ink. And without a word he began again. Not to teach, not to command, to remember. With her, through her. The paper, though thin, had not cracked. The ink, though faded, still spoke. The vow was not in the writing. It was in the choice to keep writing, even when no one remembers, even when no one asks, even when no one stays. And so the scrolls endured, not because they were hidden, but because someone stayed. Because someone looked at the world and said, this matters. Because someone chose, again and again, not to forget. Even when forgetting would have been easier, the girl would grow. One day she would walk barefoot to the river and feel the cold in the soil. She would find a smooth stone, warm in her palm, and know without knowing why that it should be placed beneath the archive's altar, and she would do it. Not because she was told, but because some silences teach more than sound ever could. So when the wind rises through the old districts of Luoyang, whispering against stone no one names anymore, and when it rattles shutters on buildings that once housed empires, it may pause near one broken wall, where a sealed door still bears the outline of a feather carved in its grain. And if you stand there and listen, not with ears but with breath, you may feel it, the hush that once belonged to Jian, the vow that once passed from paper to hand, the memory that once chose not to burn. It is still there, waiting, like ink in a bowl, undisturbed, like a word not yet written, like the past when it chooses to live.